Hey, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for this exciting panel on food justice as part of the Environmental Film Festival in our nation's capital. We have a lovely collection of experts here to talk with us. And I was wondering if each of you could go around and just quickly introduce yourselves, give the audience a little bit of a sense of what you are, what the perspective you're bringing to this conversation. I'm just looking at you on my screen right now. We'll start with the first one, which is Lauren, who I believe is the only one of you based in DC to begin with, correct?
I think that's right. So I am Lauren Schwader-Beal, Executive Director and co-founder of DC Greens. DC Greens is a health equity and food justice organization, really working to advance a just and resilient food system here in the nation's capital. And we work in a lot of different ways, including urban agriculture, but I think I'll probably be bringing a lot of food as medicine perspective to this conversation. We run a produce prescription program that I think is something that has a lot of national resonance and hopefully will be something I can bring to the conversation. Thanks for having me.
And next up on my screen, we have Breeze.
Hi, I actually have a PhD in cultural food studies and got that about 10 years ago, and focusing on the ethical consumption sector and asking the question, how does systemic whiteness, in particular anti-Blackness, manifest within even the most ethical food sectors? So it's basically using ethical food, the foodscape, to really question how the last 500 years of systemic racism have impacted our systems, including the food system. And I do that work in two different ways with the nonprofit Sister Vegan Project to look at how veganism is impacted by systemic racism, and also my own consulting firm focusing on nonprofits and for-profits doing ethical consumption services and commodities, and really helping them figure out how to be more equitable and inclusive in an intersectional anti-racist way. So that's the work I've been doing for the last 13 or 15 years. And I'm calling in from the Berkeley, California area on Ohlone land.
And Anupama?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Anupama Joshi. I am currently with the Blue Sky Funders Forum, which is a collaborative of funders that are investing in creating equitable opportunities for the outdoor experiences and outdoor learning and connections to nature. And prior to that, I founded and led the National Farm to School Network, which, as you know, Farm to School has been sort of uplifted as a food justice strategy. I also co-authored a book called Food Justice back in 2010, one of the seminal works of actually sort of framing food justice as a strategy for food systems and equitable food systems. I'm calling from the ancestral lands of the Lumbee and the Tuscarora in the Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina area.
And last but certainly not least, Raj.
Hello, my name's Raj Patel. I'm calling here from occupied Texas in what's currently called Austin. And I wear a few hats. I teach here at the University of Austin. Not University of Austin, that's the crazy right-wing one. No, I teach at the University of Texas at Austin. And I also research food systems. I've done a few books on those. But the reason I think I'm here today is because I'm also one of the co-directors of a film that's part of the festival. The film is called The Ants and the Grasshopper. And it is a sort of a long-term, 10-year-long project that sort of investigates the food system from an international perspective and thinks about climate change, patriarchy, white supremacy, and the vestiges of colonialism in the food system today. But hopefully it won't be all that heavy when we get into it.
Okay, so obviously we are covering some very big issues and very expansive topics here. But what I just wanted to start with was, for our audience, I'm sorry, to introduce myself, I'm a staff writer with GRIST. I've been an environmental journalist for about 8 years now. And in the realm of climate journalism, a lot of what we write about when it comes to the food system is how the ways in which we produce food are bad for the environment, bad for the climate. And one, to kind of turn that around, what I wanted to started with for this panel is how climate change is affecting how we consume food and how it's changed access to food, particularly for underserved communities. And I was wondering if we could go around, we'll just keep with the same, actually, no, let's mix it up. Let's go reverse order of how we introduced ourselves, with examples of how you have seen that play out in your own work. So if everyone could share an example that comes to mind of how climate change has affected how, access to food and how people eat.
Thanks for the question, Eve. So one of the things in The Ants and the Grasshopper is, this is a story about farmers in northern Malawi, one of the poorest parts of the world. And when one hears sort of stories of climate change, and when one sees them on screen, often frontline communities are represented as victims. And I think one of the important things to recognize in this question about climate change and the way we eat is that communities are inventive. And so while climate change doesn't happen in an unstructured society, it always happens in a very structured way. So one of the things that is a corollary of climate change is, for example, women who have to carry water for cooking and cleaning have to wait much longer for water to come out of the ground. They have to travel much further in order to be able to find fresh water. And that delay in a patriarchal society can often lead to increases in domestic violence. But one of the ways to respond to that is by fighting patriarchy and by actually what you're seeing is communities transforming their food systems, not just by changing what's on the plate, though that happens. And what you're seeing in Malawi, for example, is a far more diverse set of crops rather than just corn. You'll see crops, you'll see a sort of portfolio of agroecologically grown crops, so that even if there is a sort of climate crisis that affects one particular crop, there's a portfolio of different things so people are able to find a varied diet. But it's not just about responding to changing weather by changing what you grow and changing what you eat. What they've done in this particular part of northern Malawi is transform also the social relations that makes climate change an inequitable thing to start off with. And so by making sure that, for example, men are cooking and cleaning and carrying water, not only are diets changing, but the way the table is laid and who's doing the cooking and who's setting the table, that's getting changed too. And I think that's important just to flag right off the bat, because otherwise, we might sort of fall into a conversation, not in this crowd, but one might have an idea of climate change and diets merely being, the weather came and the storms washed away the crops and people just waited for USAID to come and give us a handout. And that's the opposite of what's happening.
Thank you very much, Raj.
Am I next?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I think that's a great question. I would say that at the very core, there's sort of a need for understanding that the environmental work, climate change, public health, food systems, agriculture, water, land use, green spaces, all are linked. Education as well, I should put in there, social justice, and all of these sectors are linked. So whenever you sort of take an approach that is only looking at climate change or only looking at agriculture, it really doesn't, you really will not come up with solutions that are sustainable. And so when we talk about climate change and when we talk about climate change and food systems, you have to sort of counter what's happening in agriculture. Raj mentioned water levels, land use. I think one example that I can think of is specifically around just the sort of public health aspects of climate change as well. There's a linkage with the quality of air. There's a linkage with with the green spaces in and around schools, particularly, let's say. And so using the connections with creating green spaces, but also creating opportunities for children to learn how to grow food and families to learn how to grow food with urban gardens, creating garden spaces. I think those are the kinds of sort of approaches that I've seen that have worked, and that work really because they've taken a cross-sectoral approach and have not sort of siloed, solutions and siloed problems. And so that, I think that's sort of my offering to the audience, to look at it a little more holistically.
Thank you very much, Anupama. Breeze.
This is a great question that we've been exploring a lot with the Sister Vegan Project in collaboration with communities that are engaged in teaching Black folk about the connections of more plant-based diets as opposed to farmed animal agriculture. A lot of communities of color are really negatively affected by the pollution that's produced by farm animal agriculture. So I'm working with communities and initiatives like 10 Million Black Vegan Women with Tracy McQuarter, teaching Black women different ways to garden, to grow food, and to connect it to how do we combat nutritional racism that just isn't in a vacuum, but our lack of access to land, to understanding how nutrition and food can be healing. Also working with hip hop artists like DJ Kavum out in Denver, Colorado, where he uses hip hop methodologies with youth to understand how to grow your own food. He literally raps about it, has lyrics about it to really engage the youth, and that it's like a systems issue where it's not just climate justice, as others had mentioned before, issue, but it's racial justice, it's reproductive health justice, really understanding this is where your food comes from. Let's grow it together as a community, and let's try to combat and kind of resist a lot of the junk food markets and restaurants around us. So really understanding, making those connections that the farm animal agricultural sector, the pollution there, the climate change from that, is something that we can do through really understanding how we can move more toward just growing our food, more plant-based diets. So I see that as something that many communities are doing, like with DJ Kavum in Denver, and also Hip Hop for Change by Keith Tucker. And what I do think is really great to mention is that mainstream news will tell you that communities of color in the United States, they just don't know what to do, right? Like we don't know what to do, but there's clearly plenty of evidence, not just now, but for decades, that communities of color know how to adjust and try to be innovative and resilient within these times of not just climate injustice, but racial injustice, food injustice, what have you. So that's what I've been seeing, is this shift to really make those connections and try to figure out what would look like, at least through a plant-based or vegan diet within the Black community.
Breeze, we will be coming back to a couple of those themes shortly, so get ready. And Lauren, just to wrap up this question.
Sure. I mean, I just have to say it's so exciting to be in conversation with folks that are recognizing how interconnected all of these issues are. And Anupama, I love what you mentioned about, you can't just see any of these as individualized issues, right? I mean, these are so interpenetrated. And I think what I'm really hearing, and what I certainly feel in this moment, is that, we have opportunity inside of this crisis moment because of the fact that we can be disrupting things like patriarchy. We can be disrupting white supremacy. We can be disrupting so many of the forces that have become interpenetrated to get us into the problem that we're in right now, both in terms of our food system, in terms of the systemic disinvestment from communities of color, in terms of, you name it, you can see it in the food system. And I agree that just looking at a relationship between climate change and food not only sort of misses the point, but I think misses the power of what we really can be doing in this moment. I would say, and I'll pick up on this later with some of the other questions as well, but this issue of community resiliency, I think, that is the heart of everything that we should be looking at in the future. And I think that making sure that any kind of policies or investments are actually flowing directly into the communities that have been demonstrating resiliency. I mean, at DC Greens, resiliency is part of our mission statement, and we define it as a combination of inner strength and outer resources. And what we know is that the communities that are most impacted by these issues have had inner strength forever and ever. And it's our the systems that we've created and the sort of byproduct of white supremacy culture that have actually, ensured that the necessary resources are not flowing to the communities that actually have the most inner strength and are the ones that know what solutions are necessary for their own communities. In terms of your direct question around things that we're seeing, I mean, certainly in an urban setting, the kind of heat islands that are created, particularly in communities that have had this kind of racialized systemic disinvestment for so many generations, where you don't have green space, where you've got sort of the threat of rising water. I mean, climate change, it's impacting food. Yes, it's impacting communities, and it will be impacting the cost of living, which we know is going to land most heavily on communities that are already struggling with those kind of byproducts of generations of systemic racism. So, I feel like what's exciting to me about this panel is you've got folks who are so steeped in so many different intersecting nodes and are sort of recognizing how they intersect. And so I'm not saying we'll be able to give a perfect blueprint, but we can certainly give you a kind of a picture and a big gestalt of what we all should be paying attention to.
So obviously, what we're hearing here is that power structures are really a major theme in any conversation around climate and food and environment and food. And to that end, there's been a lot of reporting with regard to all the supply chain crises that have been going on over the past couple of years about how one way to avoid those in the future, as so much climate instability or another form of economic instability could perpetuate more and more supply chain crises, is to establish and strengthen more local circular systems, whether that has to do with clothing production or food, obviously. And I was wondering if anyone can answer this question, what you see as kind of the foremost structural barriers to creating and establishing these local food systems. Is there anyone who'd like to pop in first? Breeze.
I'm going to answer the question within the newer sector that I've been working in as a consultant. It's the food tech sector. And it's a gray area, but I think there's a lot of emphasis on technocracy and neoliberal capitalism as the way to solve the problem of the food system and enough food. And I'm specifically talking about things like cultured meat, plant-based alternatives like, Beyond Meat, Impossible, that there's so much focus and money and resources always available for that particular sector. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars. And there isn't enough emphasis on, well, how do we create and sustain and support regional food systems, local food systems, especially with the most vulnerable. So I think a lot of the issue is the same of the last 500 years, where the resources, the power, especially within food tech, the VCs are all white men. I think it's like 95% funding themselves. And it's still the same privileged perspective. And then when we're talking about food tech and creating these analogs on a massive scale, it's kind of a type of monocultural, I think, that we're going toward that direction. So those are one of the problems, or one of the challenges I see, is that there's still the allocation of resources and you need the land to, grow whatever crops will be used to make those food tech commodities, it's still greatly unevenly distributed, as I also shift to looking at the food justice sphere with mostly people of color, where they don't have the land that they need to actually do more of the regional food systems for themselves and local food systems for themselves. So that's kind of how I want to answer it, is because of the work I've been doing the last few years within the food tech sector, that there seems to be a massive unequal distribution of resources around the money aspect and land and what that means. So that's one of the challenges I see, is people being marketed and fed that neoliberalism, these technological solutions to the food problem through things like Beyond Meat and other analogs are what we need to mitigate the climate issue. When, for example, we do know that farm animal agriculture is a big problem, but if we shift to a more plant-based diet using technological solutions within neoliberalism, it's still not going to solve the overarching problems over the last 500 years that, at least here in the United States, and I am based primarily in the United States when I do my work.
Oh,
Raj, I was just about to say, I saw your eyebrows going up and down a lot in response to that. So
they do that.
Yeah.
But well, I mean, just because, I mean, first of all, I think Breeze's answer nails it, because, there are all these, these tech bros who get together and just ask, what if we could have an edible NFT? Surely we could sell that for millions, and they can sell it for millions. And there is this sort of strange circle jerk of white capital that just, sort of fulfills these strange fantasies of sort of techno utopianism. At the same time, we've got these sort of stories of communities toughing it out through the pandemic and making the best of these supply chain disruptions. And there are incredible stories of communities around the world that have stepped in while, as sort of long supply chains under neoliberal capitalism have broken. Smaller sort of local based food systems have stepped in to some extent, and solidarity economies have flourished, and it's been generally a silver lining on a dark cloud. But I mean, I still think Breeze's answer is right. The problem is capitalism, because while one can and should celebrate the fact that communities have been able to weather the storm, this isn't. I mean, resilience is itself a kind of strange term, right? It's like we're so pleased the Black community is resilient against police attacks, but there shouldn't be police attacks in the first bloody place. In the same way, we're so pleased that communities in the global South are using agroecology to be resilient against climate change, but it's not their fault that climate change is happening in the first place. The idea of needing to be resilient against these external threats is preposterous. And so while it's important to recognize, yes, the supply chains are broken, yes, there are communities that have been able to engage in these sort of circular economies that to some extent exploit their own goodwill, but at the same time, communities are helping one another survive the worst of COVID and supply chain disruptions. The fact is that capitalism is parasitic on that goodwill. Capitalism depends on free, unpaid care work and the sort of reciprocal bonds of solidarity that communities have for one another. And that, I mean, I think, yes, let's celebrate and recognize, but let's also not forget that, for example, in Malawi, when communities are feeding one another, they're doing it because of the supply chain disruption around debt. A lot of folk from northern Malawi, for instance, work in South Africa in order to send money home because of long colonial histories of impoverishment and kicking people off the land and sending them away to other parts of what was then the British Empire. So the idea that okay, the supply chain has stopped, the money is not flowing from South Africa because of COVID and a range of other things, so now communities have to be resilient, is an outcome of a set of circumstances that are themselves fundamentally unjust. So again, let's recognize, let's celebrate, but let's also condemn the systems and the structures that require this kind of resilience, which is itself fundamentally a sign of people responding to injustice.
Yeah, I can jump in and sort of piggybacking on what Breeze and Raj said. Your question was about structural barriers, and I think it's interesting that I hadn't thought about this earlier, but it just came to me that there is, there are barriers because they're structured in a way that they are barriers, and they're structured by folks that are benefiting from those structures. And so just keeping that in mind, and it just two examples, I think, in the US context, whether it's the these structural barriers, be it related to food production or transportation or consumption and access, are related to policies. So in the United States, just looking at farm bill policies and farm subsidies, where certain sets of agricultural producers are favored and incentivized to grow certain kinds of products, versus others that are not, is just a structural issue. And there's certain people benefiting from it and certain people are not benefiting from it. And so it's structured that way. And so the disruption is really needed in the structure of how the policies are set up. In this, a second example, and then I'll let Lauren jump in as well, because she has a lot of experience with this as well. But in the work that I did with the farm to school work, again, if you're trying to use schools and early childhood centers as sort of as hubs in the community where there's an opportunity to sort of create a local food system, with using schools and early childhood centers, and using them to support local and regional producers to bring in foods into the school system, bring in healthy foods into the school system, so that our kids' palates are being developed in the right way. There are barriers to how school food regulations are structured as well. So it's not just about sort of agriculture policy, it's also about nutrition policy, and it's about sort of how we are looking at educational policy as well. Food not being a central part of education is just right at the start of it a problem, and something that needs to be resolved. And just in the work that I've done with Farm to School, there were so many, and Lauren can talk about this as well. Just, simple things like school garden product, not being seen as safe. That it's a product that's grown right here outside, right? What is the problem in consuming that, right? Versus something that's coming from thousands of miles away. Just getting a regulation in place to say that, so that school food authorities are able to use school garden products safely, and without thinking that somebody's going to come after them because they are violating some guidelines. Simple things like that, I think, are structured, are structural issues that can be resolved. So and have been. There's positive things that have happened, clearly. But yeah, I'll pause there and have Lauren jump in too.
Yeah, I'm so glad you started talking about policy. And honestly, for me, with the Flint water crisis, I think what occurred to me is that as a nation, we believe that access to clean water should be a right for all people, and that cities should be providing clean water to their residents. And there was a lot of very real indignation around Flint, and a push to lift that up. That it wasn't always the case. It wasn't until the turn of the century that when the connection was actually made between cholera and clean water, that cities started to see this as a public health issue, and they started to realize that it was their job to invest in the infrastructure that guaranteed clean water to people in their cities. And I've been saying for since Flint that I believe we're sort of in that cholera moment right now for food, where the connections have been clearly made between food insecurity and all of the diet-related chronic illnesses like diabetes, hypertension, that we know are landing more heavily on communities of color. These same communities where you have sort of unclean, unhealthy food getting piped in by the kind of capitalist system that gets that targets Black youth and tries to get people hooked on products. There's this is clearly a public health issue. And what I think that means is that we need to be pushing our cities, and I'm in a city state here, so cities, states, our country, to start to create policies that guarantee a clean food system for all people, right? And that isn't about giving food away. that is about improving the quality of school food. It's about Medicaid waivers so that folks who are receiving Medicaid can get access to healthy food as a component of their medical care. It's about tax incentives for grocery stores. It is about creating central processing facilities so that communities actually have the ability to process foods and have them, more locally circulated. I mean, it's about, passing legislation that limits greenhouse gas emissions related to, procurement for institutional food. I mean, there's a huge range of policies that we need to be pushing for as we start to see this as a public health issue. And I think, for me, I'll be honest, I don't spend a lot of time on the climate change piece of this work. So I think, for me, in thinking about this, I realized, okay, I've been talking about this cholera moment for the food system, really in relation to kind of the food as medicine push and a lot of the regulation, but really we're talking about a planetary disease. And we're talking about a public health issue that is coming from climate change. And if we want to, I think it is necessary, if we're going to work inside of the system that we have all been born into, to try and change it in a direction that makes sense, honing in on that public health issue and then moving policy that will remove structural barriers. I think, at least in the short term, is where we're putting our energy.
Thank you all for those responses. One recurring theme, certainly in my work and the work of my colleagues, is it's very hard to separate power structure and language, like the words that we use to describe problems and the words that we use to describe systems as well. And I wanted to point this directly to Breeze because she has written and spoken on this. But the term food desert has become, it went from kind of niche to very commonplace. And now there's kind of a pushback against it. And I was wondering, Breeze, if you could illuminate that for the audience.
Yeah, I would love to. And I want to give proper credit to Karen Washington, I believe, I'm sorry if I got her name wrong, as the one who coined the term food apartheid. And when I'm talking to clients and students about the differences, is that deserts, it sounds like, or it feels like it's just a naturally occurring ecosystem. And it's unfair to say that it's a food desert when we know deserts have their own rich ecosystems and life living there. When you say apartheid, then we make the shift to understand that apartheid has been strategically orchestrated to subjugate certain human populations and to also benefit those who want to maintain and hold power. So when we're talking about food, that food is a key way to control and hold power over those that you want to subjugate. So when we think about the ways in which land is used or misused, how people have access to certain foods, and why is it that we will go into certain parts of the United States and we will see that with low-income communities of color, that they don't have access to land and to healthier food choices. We also talked about the school systems, where at least where I live in the Berkeley area, where it's wealthier, that the children have better access to nutritional education, growing food. But you don't have that in more urban schools with low-income communities of color. So that's been orchestrated. Why is it that places like Safeway, which the Food Empowerment Project is trying to shed more light on, that they won't allow other grocers to come into communities of color that need it once they leave. Just really thinking about the ways in which food is controlled and those choices and access is a form of apartheid. So that's what I think it's really interesting that a lot of people don't understand the power of decolonizing language, or at least dismantling the languages that we were using that makes obscure how we got to where we are in terms of not just the food system, but any system. So that's why I think that not just saying food apartheid, but even with my work, talking about equity, inclusion, and not just diversity. A lot of people are like, let's have Cultural Awareness Day. Let's celebrate our differences. And then I say, let's shift the language and talk about how white supremacy operates in the workplace, just naming it and saying it so we understand, oh, that's the language we should be using. And now let's understand that history of why is Breeze saying this is a white supremacist logic in the workplace versus let's celebrate our cultural differences. So I think that's where we need to start talking about how we use language and the connotations that are drawn in our head when we start thinking about language that way, and how we can make it a more, I guess in the aspect that I'm doing with food, like more anti-racist language, more decolonial language, so we can shift the way we're thinking about these things and do that work of, that's odd. Why, yeah, for years I have been thinking about it as a desert. Now apartheid makes more sense. So strategically, why were we taught that to begin with, that it's food desert? Why were we taught, let's just celebrate our differences versus, hey, we have a white supremacy problem here in this workplace that's focused on food.
Can I jump in on this also? I'm really grateful for this question, and also very grateful for the work of Karen Washington. And it's been something we certainly have lifted up as well. And two other terms that I have heard Black leaders use that I just want to put into the conversation as well. Ambrose Lane Jr. from the Ward 7 Health Alliance here in the city often talks about food swamps. And deploys these phrases strategically, of course, which I think is part of the power of language. But I think in thinking about again the fact that in the community where he lives and works, there's a 17-year life expectancy difference from the wealthier parts of the city, and 4 of the 5 leading causes of death are diet-related chronic illnesses. The food swamp, that is what's available is sort of swamp. So I wanted to lift that up. And then Pastor Heber Brown from the Black Church Food Security Network has also talked about food mirages, which I find very powerful, particularly for folks who are living in communities where the food is there, they simply don't have the resources to be able to purchase it, and so it's there, but it's like it's not there. And I think that's also been again something that I just want to lift up, and things that I've heard from leaders that I've found very, very moving. The last thing I'll just say, and Breeze, it sounds like you're doing this as well, is I find when somebody uses the term food desert, it's an opportunity to get in there and actually start the conversation about kind of the re-educating, the pulling back of this phrase, and allows immediately for a conversation about structural racism in the food system, which, I guess I offer to the listeners as, if you do hear food desert, I think collectively we are trying to not just eradicate, but use that as an opportunity to actually shine a light on, everything that Breeze just said, how we got here to begin with. So, hope that you all who are listening join us in that effort of taking the opportunity to start a conversation that's real.
And Anupama and Raj, not necessarily on the food desert term, but I'm wondering if in your work, if there's an example of language that you would like to see changed because of how it misrepresents the problem at hand.
Yeah, I can jump in, and I'm sort of moving a little bit away from core food work, but some work that that I'm currently involved with is is about creating a shared narrative about the benefits of time spent outdoors and in nature as a human right, essentially. And the work around this sort of creating a shared language and creating a shared narrative came about because there was an intentional there was an understanding and an intentional move towards wanting to get to a point where all of the work that's happening related to environmental education, connecting people with nature for all the benefits that it provides, mental and health benefits, mental and physical health benefits, should be accessible to all. So it's sort of a parallel to food access, I would say, piece. And what we found in the communications research that was done was that even the words nature, outside, and outdoors are sort of used interchangeably in the field, but that nature has a connotation that it's somewhere out there, that it's sort of not for me. I need to, go to a national park, let's say, to enjoy it. Outdoors is something that can happen, right outside my house, or in my backyard. And then outside is a much more sort of, outside and outdoors being much more, interchangeably used as well, where they seem like it's doable for everybody. Outdoors, also has a connotation where I sort of need to, get a backpack on and go somewhere. I need to have gear to use it. And so again, touching on the points of, who has access to these things, whether it's available to communities of color and, and everybody, or is it, elitist? So sort of getting away from that elitist language. And so there's a sort of move towards rethinking outside is the campaign that we've got currently, that I'm working on currently, to change the narrative about who has access to the outdoors and who's benefiting from it. So that's just a parallel example that I wanted to share.
Oh, that's perfect, because I mean I love the idea that we need to sort of reclaim and decolonize the idea of nature, because here's humans over here and then nature over there, and then you'll jump in your car and you'll get to nature ultimately. Is actually a sort of a very colonial way of thinking about the outdoors and nature, cleared of indigenous people and the workers who are perhaps there and living in some sort of concert with the environment. No. Nature is always pristine and human free. That idea, I think, definitely is part of, actually gets back to Breeze's idea about sort of the tech bro culture, right? But when you think about these solutions for hunger, I mean, solution is a word that I'd like to see banished. And honestly, food insecurity is another term I'd like to see go away, because, it obfuscates the politics of hunger and of oppression and of, structural exploitation. So, food insecurity sanitizes in the way that nature kind of sort of papers over the fact that we are nature. And in our alienation from what it is that we are a part of, we've licensed all kinds of extinction in order to be able to feed the world and let our tech bros come in with their wonderful chemistry to be able to give us soylent so that we can survive into the 21st century. So I mean, I think that there's a lot of colonialism that's sort of wed in our language. Everything from immunity, which is a term that originally comes from Roman colonialism, to ideas of nature and society and civilization. All of this, these are terms that obfuscate and often hide the kinds of power relations we've been talking about.
Raj, I'd love for you to say a little bit more on why you would like to see the term solutions banished.
Oh, come on. I mean, the idea of solutions is precisely that do this one thing and you are done. A solution in a bottle, or, that there is some sort of magic thing. I mean, the idea of solutions is pure magic beans talk, right? I mean, it's you will engage in a transformation into genetically modified crops. So we will eat magic meat or whatever it is, and that's a solution to this particular problem space. And it is, in its sort of corporate bullshittery, a way of, again, misdirecting our attention from the sort of structures of power and exploitation, which actually we've got a very good history of understanding the kinds of ideas that have worked to end oppression. And they don't come in a bottle. They aren't solutions. Strikes and strategies for reclaiming worker power and ideas of rebellion and independence and decolonization. Decolonization wasn't the solution for colonialism. That's not the way it's represented misrepresented, and that's not the way to think about it. Decolonization is a process that is, in the same way that I will forever be fighting the patriarchy in me, and I will, it's just a lifelong process. There's no solution to patriarchy other than, an ongoing struggle an ongoing idea that freedom is a constant struggle. And solutions and that kind of solutions talk makes you think that, you do this one thing for 20 minutes and it's done. And that's not the way the world works. That's not the way change happens.
Not to mention the fact that these types of issues that we're dealing with are sort of classic wicked problems, right? They're not linear. It's not, if you find your solution over here, I guarantee you are creating 85 problems over here, right? And so, I think the kind of notion of a solution, we're in a fractal tangle. And we need to, I think, recognize that if we're going to be sort of respectfully doing the work. I love what you just said, Rajan. Obviously, you drew on patriarchy, but uprooting, identifying, and dismantling white supremacy culture is the work of, is daily work for everyone, most of all for white people, or should be.
Yeah, I just want to sort of thread the solutions piece with food convenience. I think the convenience food sort of industry, certainly is at its core sort of, totally not supportive of a local and regional food system. And so I think just sort of bringing it back to our food systems, conversation, and that's something that that's sort of the work of the local and regional food systems, is to sort of get away from that convenience culture, convenience food availability that we've gotten used to, where you can get a solution like this, right? And you can pop a pill and your nutrition is taken care of. That's not all right? That's just not the way nature intended it to be, for us to live and eat and enjoy food. And so just wanted to pull that thread back.
If it's not clear to viewers after this panel, I don't know how. Definitely in my own work, in my own reporting, like the very convoluted, what was the term you used, Lauren? Fractal tangle of any climate related problem, honestly, any race related problem, economic problem. There's just so much to undo. And one theme that's kind of come up over the past 2 years is like, okay, we have this opportunity to reset all of the structures that have not been serving us after, so much has fallen apart over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I was wondering how optimistic each of you feels about that opportunity for a reset.
I can jump in. I'm a glass half full kind of person, so I do feel optimistic about an opportunity, and I think it is an opportunity for sure. The pandemic certainly has sort of has forced us, I think, all to think differently about lots of different things in our lives and in how we live and eat and and work and everything else too. So I think there's opportunities to sort of rethink ways of doing things and as using the time is now, I think, because people have done things differently over the last 2 years, and there's an opportunity that we shouldn't be missing to change things. So just coming back to the school food work that I've done, there's huge changes in how schools have been operating over the last 2 years in the pandemic, not just with the educational learning, virtual learning aspects of it, but also the food aspect of it in terms of how that's worked and how schools have really been sort of serving as a community hub with school buses going to deliver foods to kids, but also to families, distributing seeds to families so that they're sort of able to grow food on their own. All of that stuff I think needs to be brought together in some way so that we are doing things differently and using this as an opportunity.
I'll jump in. I also am a sort of eternal optimist, which is maybe my blessing and my curse. But I have seen, I mean, particularly in the food as medicine space, it has been a dramatic shift. I mean, this is a space that, I've been working in for a decade, and suddenly, with the pandemic, people were finally starting to put, and I hear you, Raj, about food insecurity, and I'm going to sit and think on it. I know that for the clinical space that I'm working in, having a clinical term like that has been an absolute game changer. And so for them to be able to have a kind of a screening that's around food, and this is me working inside of the belly of the existing beast, but that's we all work in different ways. And I don't know that it needed to be the term that the whole universe took on, but certainly in the clinical setting, I will say, even just the integration of food insecurity screeners into clinical care so that people understand and start to see the concrete connections between really poverty is what we're talking about, right? And the diet-related chronic illnesses that suddenly are also, what's the word I'm looking for? Underlying conditions for COVID mortality. Oh, suddenly people realize that diabetes and hypertension are actually killing communities of color. Like, that's been going on. But the light that's gone on, and the number of health systems that have reached out and said, how do we do this? And the conversations that are happening on the Hill, the coming together of the food as medicine space to, again, start to actually create policies that integrate access to healthy food as a core component of healthcare delivery. That's a sea change. And and sadly, it actually it relies on the language of capitalism. I mean, it is about, is this what's the return on investment to the healthcare system to be able to give people access to healthy food? And you have to end up speaking the vernacular of that system in order to get these changes made. But what I see is much more will to actually move in that direction. And then the hope is that it opens from there. And, I have to say, I call myself a pragmatic utopian, but also someone who practices relentless incrementalism. And I feel some level of shame that I have the privilege to be able to take on questions in an incremental way when I know that they are so pressing and so urgent for so many friends and colleagues and folks of color living in this country. So there you have it from me.
Oh, sorry. Take it away, Breeze. Sorry, I'm wrestling.
Oh no, no, I was trying to unmute myself. So, what I was just hearing you say was capitalism, and I'm not optimistic. I'm not pessimistic. I'm realistic, and for me, like, capitalism seems to be the overarching problem. Not to say that you wouldn't have a problem if we had alternative economic systems, but it seems like that's a big problem. And then I'm thinking about the ways in which COVID has exacerbated what was already happening. And then you were talking about, using nutrition and more health education and access to really understand that if you already have these underlying conditions, of course, the racialized and low-income populations of color are going to have higher rates of mortality when they get infected with COVID. So I was thinking about going back to the work that I'm doing, that suddenly there's a lot more care about the essential workers because our bottom line, we're going to lose our bottom line if we don't care about our essential workers, right? So once again, it's all about the bottom line. It's capitalism again. It's not necessarily because it's the moral and just thing to do to actually treat people like they're human beings. So I'm a little hesitant to think that there has been any type of deep learning moments for those who could actually make the changes they need to, because in honesty, they know how the game is. They've played it for 500 years or more. They've organized it and orchestrated that way. So the communities of color who have always been affected and have had to survive and innovate through colonialism, like my parents are working class Black people. I mean, they're not extremely poor. However, they're working class. They live paycheck to paycheck. And my dad's like, COVID, that's just one extra thing that's already been happening that we have to, it's just yet another thing. You know, it's not like they're going to learn something from it. He's like, we're going to adapt. We're going to try to figure it out. But what I'm hesitant to think is that those with the actual power will take this as something that they gains momentum. Like, is it going to be a movement or is it just a moment? Because I'm already seeing it in my work where people are in, let's get back to work now, right? COVID looks like it's, we're going to the point where we're able to find some type of harmony and go back to the workplace, go back to commute, start focusing on business. So I feel like it could have been a moment, but those in power, I think they're not going to give up their possessive investments in this white capitalist patriarchal mode of not just the food system, but the food system in general. So to answer your question, I don't think those in power really, they know, they've gotten the reports and they've been told who has been greatly affected by COVID, but I don't think it's enough to really change them lessons learned so they can focus more on justice and the bottom line. So maybe I am pessimistic. We'll see.
I'm with you, Breeze. I'm a pessimist of the intellect and an optimist of the will. I mean, look, we're in the middle of a climate crisis. We had a fantastic opportunity to reduce our carbon emissions. Went down for a little bit because we all stayed inside. And then we decided, no, we can't possibly do that. We must sacrifice working class people so that we can go back to normal. And now our carbon emissions are up. And despite some nice words at COP26, I'm sure we'll have more of those at COP27. The US continues to be a leader in polluting the planet. So there are moments here where folk can take a step back and think about shaving a little bit off their carbon footprint. But in terms of the structures of capitalism, yes, we had a little bit of celebration of the working class, and a round of applause for all of them. But that's stopped. You'll have noticed. And insofar as the working class are getting slightly higher wages, those have been eroded by the inflationary impact of companies taking bigger profits. If you look at this inflation spiral that we're in at the moment, that's particularly important in the food system, but also in energy and thinking about climate and about the sixth extinction we're in the middle of, then you'll see that actually the trends are largely negative. So is there a moment here? Yes, I think there is. Insofar as workers discovering power, insofar as we see social movements coming together and schooling one another, insofar as we're seeing sort of a sea change in some of the conversations, for example, on the American right around climate change, bending a little bit towards acknowledging that perhaps it's a thing that I'm excited about. It's about damn time, but I'm excited it's happening. But it's, is that enough to outweigh the vast juggernaut that we're sitting on, riding towards really, a climate catastrophe? We're already in the sixth extinction. I'm afraid, in the balance of pessimism of intellect and optimism of will, I might lean a little bit more pessimistic.
I think you might have taken me there too, both of you.
I guess I'm a little sorry to our audience that we have to close on that note, but I would like everyone to really embrace, as I will, Raj's term, pessimist of intellect, optimist of will. I'm going to remember that one.
Gramsci, it's not mine. It's the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci popularized it in the 1930s.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for your very thoughtful responses to these questions and for everything you've brought to this conversation. And I would like to encourage our audience to look everybody up and follow them on social media and follow their work going forward, and to watch Raj's movie, of course. Thank you so much. I've had a lovely hour with you all, and I hope to talk more again sometime.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye now.